Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is George Herrera with the Queens Home team at Keller Williams Realty. In today's video, I'm answering a question, more so addressing a topic and a few questions that were mentioned in a recent Reddit thread, a Reddit forum where someone wrote in and kind of explained a whole situation and wanted to get some advice. I figured I would share this because this is something that you can come across here in Queens also, and it might be insightful for any of our viewers here on our channel. So here goes the situation. The subject of the thread is seller will not vacate. Okay, now they said we're scheduled to close on Friday. Today we received word that the seller won't be moved out. We already switched utilities, and it says they have furniture already scheduled to be delivered. The walkthrough is Friday morning. At what point does the seller become in default of the contract? They said that the seller said that they were going to show up to closing but not be moved out. The contract says they get possession at closing with the keys, which is standard contracts. And so the agent, this person here said their agent has never experienced this and didn't know how to handle it. Now, for here in New York City, in Queens, the way we would handle this, right, and this can happen, you get near closing and for one reason or another, the seller isn't ready to move out. This has even happened to our sellers. Life happens, and for one reason or another, as you get close to closing, something can happen that affects the seller being able to vacate by the set closing date. Now, usually we find out before a closing is even scheduled, so we can still try to coordinate things. But with this scenario, there was already a closing date set, and they had a final walkthrough set. So that means they already had their closing on the books, and they're ready to close, and all of a sudden the seller says they won't vacate. So what happens in this situation? Now, the first question was when does the seller become in default of the contract? Now, here in New York State, it's an on or about state, meaning that when you have a closing date in a contract, it's usually on or about that date. And whatever date is set in the contract, both the buyer and the seller typically get a 30-day grace period from that date, whereby neither party is in default of a contract, right? So let's say you go into contract, it's on or about 60 days. So let's say the date on there is 60 days later. From there, if for whatever reason the buyer or the seller need an extra 30 days, they can do that and still be within the terms of the contract, not be in default. After that 30-day grace period, that's when a buyer or a seller will become in default of the contract. Okay, so that's something important to keep in mind in New York. Now, in this situation, you have the buyer and the seller who have a closing on the books. All of a sudden, the seller says that they can't move out. In this situation, it usually gets negotiated by the agents and or the attorneys, because what would happen is that there either would be money held in escrow. So many times, if you're going to stick to the closing date, if the buyer is comfortable with it and the seller is not ready to move out yet, most of the time you'll negotiate, or the attorneys would negotiate post-close possession for a certain amount of time. This can be a week, it can be 2 weeks, up to a month, that we've seen. And typically what will happen is that there becomes a per diem charge. So a certain amount of money gets held in escrow, and that's what the sellers risk losing if they don't end up moving out. They'll lose that money. So money held in escrow. And on top of that, many times the attorneys will negotiate a certain per diem amount that is paid daily. So it will be a daily rate that the sellers have to pay until they close, right? And this can vary. So this you would speak with your attorney about, but typically it's a per day rate that the sellers have to pay for every day that they haven't moved out. Now, the other option, right, if for some reason a buyer may not be comfortable with that, they might want the property vacant, and knowing that you already have a closing date set, a buyer might say, no, we want it vacant and we don't want anyone in possession of the home after we close. We want to get the keys. We want it vacant on title. So in that situation, the closing would need to be postponed. So you would adjourn that closing that you had on the books, and the attorneys would need to work out a new closing date, and the seller would need to let all parties know when they can be out. So this does happen. So at this point is where you kind of just become human and you try to find a win-win agreement. So something could have happened where it just is becoming a really challenging for the seller to move out by that closing date. So many times they just need, 4 or 5 more days. They might just need 1 more week and then they can be out. And in those scenarios, you either agree to the post-close possession, or if a buyer is not comfortable with that, they can say, okay, let's postpone the closing until they're ready to be out by closing. So that's what would happen. Even if the seller was past their 30-day grace period and they are technically in default of the contract, if the seller says, we can be out, it'll just take us another week or even 2 weeks, that's no reason to cancel a contract. So we usually don't see deals fall apart at that point, because at that point it's just a matter of, how much time do you need? If it's another week, okay, we wait another week, or we offer post-close possession for 1 week with a per day rate for the stay. So either way, at that point, it just becomes a negotiation. It's obviously not ideal, especially if you have all these things happening with the new home, furniture, utilities, things like that. But life happens. So just be understanding if you come across this situation that yes, it can be possible and you do have options. Just consult with your attorney and consult with your agent to find a win-win agreement that works for everybody. All right. Hopefully that gives you a little insight into this situation in case you ever come across it. If you have any questions or any topics that you'd like us to address on the channel, please drop them in the comments below. We're always looking for new content to put out to our viewers here on the channel. Thanks as always for tuning in, y'all. Stay tuned for the next episode. Take care and have a great day.